Hi, it's Professor Davis, and I want to take a look at the topics checklist for sections 1.5 and 2.2. So let's take a look at that. In section 1.5, this is a non-computational section, just like the other sections in chapter 1 were. And a couple of things we want to take a look at there is first, be able to distinguish between an observational study and an experiment. And you'll find some exercises at the end of this section that'll help you with that. And also, be acquainted with the definition of the term simple random sample. There are two components to the simple random sample. First, by random, we mean that every element in the population has an equally likely chance of being selected for the sample. And two, every element in the population can only be chosen once to be in the sample. So the first part that I talked about, the equally likelihood, that's the random part, and the simple part means it can't be duplicated. So be acquainted with that. Sometimes that term will be used, simple random sample. And then finally, I guess the major thing in this section is to be able to identify the 4 types of sampling methods that are used, whether they be systematic, convenient sampling, cluster sampling, or stratified sampling. So make sure you look at the exercises in that section on how to differentiate those 4 types. So that finishes off chapter 1. Now, the first section in every chapter henceforth is an introductory section, a review and preview section. So we're going to move to, you can read over that if you want. There's no content material in it per se. Moving on to section 2.2 on frequency distributions. First, we want to be able to use the 6-step procedure to construct a frequency distribution from a set of data. Now, when we use the word distribution in statistics, we mean the word table. So we want to be able to make a frequency table from a set of data using that 6-step process you'll see in your ebook, page 48. Also, once we get that frequency distribution done, we want to be able to add on a few extra columns for it. First, the midpoint, the class midpoint, we want to be able to add that column to compute the midpoint of a class. Then the relative frequency, that's where we take the frequency of a class and then divide that by the complete sample size. And then the cumulative frequency, that's a frequency of a class plus the frequencies of the classes that come before it. So we want to be able to add those 3 columns, the midpoints, the relative frequency, and the column frequency. We'll use all of those when we get to section 2.4 on other types of graphs. And then the last thing I just wanted to emphasize is we want to be able to compute the class width for a frequency distribution. Remember, the class width is the difference between 2 consecutive lower class limits. So we always want to take, or it's also the difference between 2 consecutive upper class limits. So we want to subtract those numbers. If you take the upper limit minus the lower limit, you'll always get the wrong answer. You'll always be off by 1. So that's not the way we compute the class width. We take the difference between 2 consecutive lower class limits or 2 consecutive upper class limits, or we could also take the difference between 2 consecutive class midpoints and get the class width as well. So in terms of exercises we want to practice this week, in section 1.5, starting on page 34, we want to do problems 5 through 19 odd. And then in section 2.2, starting on page 53, problems 5 through 15 odd. And remember, since we have chapter 1 complete, we want to be able to do the online quiz on that chapter. And also just keep in mind that you have 2 attempts to do each of the online quizzes. Your highest score of those 2 quizzes is the one that's counted. So that's the topics checklist for sections 1.5 and 2.2.